In the frozen reaches of Jotunheim, where the wind howls like forgotten spirits and ice covers the land like a curse, the spark of something ancient and volatile was born. Amidst a thunderous storm, a child came screaming into existence, a child fated to reshape the balance between gods and giants. His father was Farboti, a brutal Jotun who embodied raw destruction, and his mother, Laufey, was a slender, secretive woman with a mind sharp as frost and a heart full of hidden flame. Their union was as improbable as it was dangerous, and from it came Loki, an anomaly, a paradox in flesh. He was born with raven-black hair and ember-like eyes, as if forged by lightning itself. From his earliest breaths, Loki defied expectation. He was no towering brute like the Jotnar, nor was he bound by the honor-driven pride of the Aesir. Instead, he danced on the edge of everything, too clever to be ignored, too dangerous to be trusted. The other Jotnar whispered that he was touched by the primordial chaos, a living embodiment of change and rebellion. Wherever Loki roamed, things shifted. He could bend the truth like molten metal, twist shapes with a thought, and unravel even the sturdiest plans with a single word. The world never stayed the same when he passed through it, and neither did the hearts of those around him. Yet in his restless spirit grew a longing, not for power, but for place. Loki wanted belonging, not as a Jotun, nor as a god, but as something in between, something that hadn't yet been defined. Drawn to Asgard, the shining realm of divine order and purpose, Loki presented himself before Odin. The Allfather, ever wise and wary, saw in the boy not just mischief but potential, a mind unchained by tradition, a spirit that could walk through fire and emerge laughing. In a sullen rite beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, Odin cut his palm and offered his blood. Loki did the same. In that moment, bound by an oath older than the gods themselves, Loki became blood brother to Odin and kin to the Aesir. Asgard accepted him in name, but never fully in heart. Thor, Frigga, Sif, they watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Loki earned his keep not with brute strength, but with cunning. He solved the impossible, tricked the unbeatable, and occasionally saved the very gods who mistrusted him. Yet every deed, whether noble or mischievous, added another thread to the web of fate that even the Norns watched with apprehension. For Loki was the god of stories unwritten, of paths untaken, of laughter that could cut like a blade. In Asgard's halls, golden and serene, he was the flame among stone, a necessary chaos in a world obsessed with order. But in that flame flickered a shadow, a flicker of pain, of never truly belonging, of knowing that one day his loyalty and his laughter would be tested. And far beneath the 9 realms, ancient things stirred, for the birth of the Trickster was no random chance. It was the first ripple of a coming storm. Now bound by blood to Odin and named among the gods, Loki walked the golden halls of Asgard not as a prisoner or outsider, but as one of the Aesir. Yet even in splendor he wore the title like a borrowed cloak. The high towers of Valhalla glistened in the daylight, but in their reflection, Loki saw his own smirk twist into something more curious, more cunning. He belonged, but not completely. Welcomed, yet always watched. The gods admired his wit, albeit with gritted teeth. When the Aesir debated war or peace, Loki's tongue sliced sharper than any sword. He could spin riddles that confounded Heimdall, and speak with a silvered elegance that even Frigga found charming. When Asgard's builders were tricked into working without reward, it was Loki's cunning that ensured the gods weren't bound by foolish bargains, though he had been the one to strike the bargain in the first place. It was in these early days that Loki earned his place as both savior and schemer. When Thor's mighty hammer Mjolnir vanished, It was Loki who, with a shapeshift and a silver tongue, discovered it in the hands of a lecherous giant. And it was Loki who, with equal parts audacity and brilliance, convinced Thor to don a bridal gown and infiltrate the frost giant's keep to retrieve it. The gods laughed, the hammer was returned, and Thor's enemies were shattered. Yet none forgot who orchestrated it all. Despite his victories, whispers clung to Loki like cobwebs. Jottun's spawn, some muttered. Too clever by half, others said. Odin, ever wise, kept Loki close, not out of blind trust, but because he saw what others refused to. Loki was the embodiment of necessary chaos. Without him, Asgard would grow complacent, too rigid in its glory. But with him there was always fire in the forge, always wind beneath the wings. And yet, beneath Loki's gleaming tricks and arrogant charm lay something deeper, a wound that never closed. In every celebration, he felt the sting of being the outsider. In every jest he made, there was an edge of defiance. He had learned to smile with his mouth while his heart burned in silence. Thor, beloved son of Odin, was cheered for every feat of strength. Loki, despite his genius, remained the subject of suspicion. The gods needed him, but they didn't truly trust him. And worse, they never feared him. So he began to test the boundaries. Just a little more with each passing century. He turned himself into a mare to distract a giant stallion, only to return bearing a child, the 8-legged horse Sleipnir, Odin's future steed. The tale was retold with laughter, but many stared too long, questioning the depth of his magic and what rules he might break next. He travelled to Midgard disguised as countless creatures, an old man, a child, a falcon, and observed mortals with curious fascination. Unlike the gods, humans were fluid, unpredictable, and often more accepting. Loki admired that. Their chaos reflected his own. But it also fueled a flicker of envy. Why could they be flawed and beloved, while he, the ever-resourceful, remained chained by mistrust? It was during one of these travels that Loki discovered darker things stirring in the roots of Yggdrasil. Secrets that even Odin had ignored. A serpent whispered in his ear in the deep places of the world. A prophecy, a glimpse of a time when fire and ice would consume all, and he, Loki, would stand at the center of it. He laughed at the vision, but he remembered it. From that day on, his tricks became sharper, his tests more dangerous, and his alliances more blurred. He was still the god of mischief, still the savior when things grew desperate. But the shadow that trailed behind him was growing longer. And the gods, though they would not yet admit it, had begun to fear the price of his brilliance. Time passed, and Loki's name became woven into the fabric of Asgard's most celebrated and most shameful tales. No god stirred as much laughter, or dread, as he. He was the storm before the stillness, the whisper behind every unexplainable turn of fate. His gifts were undeniable. He could create what others could only dream of. But every gift had a cost, and every trick carried a shadow. It began subtly. A mischievous joke here, a clever sleight there. He turned Sif's golden hair to strands of shadow as a jest, an act that nearly cost him his life at Thor's hand. But when the Thunderer raised his hammer, Loki, ever resourceful, offered a solution. He journeyed to Svartalfheim, home of the dwarves, and returned not only with new golden locks for Sif, but with gifts that would shape the fate of gods and men alike. Odin's spear Gungnir, Freyr's ship Skidbladnir, and of course, Mjolnir, the hammer that would become Thor's eternal companion. In this, Loki earned both praise and suspicion. Without him, these treasures would not exist, said some. But we needed them only because of him, whispered others. The gods learned to approach Loki with caution. For every problem he solved, it seemed he had first created the need for a solution. He was the key and the lock, the fire and the ash. Yet he was not evil, not yet. There were times when Loki showed glimpses of loyalty, even love. When Idun and her apples of youth were stolen, it was Loki who braved the realm of the giants to return them. When the monstrous wolf Fenrir grew beyond control, Loki pleaded with the gods to find a path other than chains. "He is still my son," he said, voice edged with something too raw to be trickery. But the gods only saw the beast, not the father's gaze behind it. For you see, Loki, too, was a father, though not of gentle things. By the giantess Angrboda, he sired children that would haunt the dreams of the Aesir. Jormungandr, the world serpent, whose coils circled Midgard, Hel, the half-dead queen of the underworld, and Fenrir, destined to devour Odin himself. These children, feared by all, were torn from him by the gods. Jormungandr was hurled into the ocean's depths. Hel was banished to rule Niflheim. And Fenrir, he was tricked into chains, and when the final ribbon Gleipnir bound him, the wolf howled a sound that shook the sky, and Loki did not forgive. Though Loki laughed louder than ever, there was venom beneath it now. He'd have been wounded not by sword, but by loss. Asgard took everything from him and expected gratitude in return. He began to test the cracks, pushed boundaries others feared to approach. He whispered in the ears of giants and mortals. He questioned Odin's wisdom openly, challenged Heimdall's silence, and mocked Freya's vanity with cruel wit. He walked the halls of the gods as both guest and ghost. Yet the gods still tolerated him. Why? Because they needed him. When knowledge failed, when diplomacy broke, when no path forward could be seen, they turned to Loki, and time and again he delivered. But the more they used him, the more they reminded him he did not truly belong. He was the match that lit their torches, and would one day become the fire that consumed their world. And Loki knew it. He began to dream of Ragnarok, not with dread, but with hunger. Despite the flickering goodwill that sometimes returned, the shadows surrounding Loki only grew longer. As the gods began to watch him not with amusement, but with apprehension, Loki felt the boundaries tighten. His once bold steps across the halls of Asgard were now met with guarded glances. The line between companion and outcast was thinning. Even those who had once laughed at his mischief, Thor, Balder, and Frigg, had begun to question whether the trickster still knew the difference between jest and malice. The breaking point was not a cataclysm, it was 1,000 cuts. It was when Odin stopped confiding in him. It was when Freya recoiled at his teasing, no longer sensing any love behind it. It was when Thor, for the first time, raised Mjolnir not in jest, but in warning. Still, Loki smiled. He always did, but behind it burned a rage deeper than Helheim itself. Then came Balder, the most beloved of the gods, radiant and pure, dreamt of his own death. Alarmed, Frigg demanded oaths from all living things not to harm him. But in her haste, she overlooked a small, unassuming sprig of mistletoe. Loki noticed. He had watched for too long how Balder's light cast his own shadows darker. He watched how the gods adored him, praised him, worshipped him, as if Balder were the future of Asgard, while Loki was its flaw. So he devised a plan. With the mistletoe sharpened into a dart, he guided the blind god-hodder's hand, turning a harmless game into a tragedy. The dart flew true. Balder fell. And with him, so did Loki's last thread of forgiveness. The gods wept. Odin's silence deepened. Frigg's mourning became a storm. Thor roared like thunder unbound. And Loki, once the god of laughter, became the god of betrayal. He fled Asgard, no longer just a trickster but a fugitive. The halls where he had once played and plotted were closed to him. He would return, but not as a guest. The bonds of kinship had been severed by his own hand. He wandered the 9 realms, now as a hunted thing, but not broken. For Loki saw something the gods refused to see, the rot beneath their perfection, the arrogance in their supposed order. And deep in the void where light could not reach, he began to scheme anew. Not tricks, not pranks, but reckoning. Because the end was no longer something to fear, it was something to prepare for. Ragnarök whispered through his thoughts like a hymn. And with each whisper he planned the fall of gods, not in haste, but with the patience of someone who had been wronged by eternity itself. And thus the shadow of betrayal grew long, ready to engulf the golden halls that had once turned their back on him. Loki had vanished into the cracks of the 9 realms, but the echoes of his crime thundered through every branch of Yggdrasil. Balder, the light of Asgard, was gone, and with his fall, the gods could no longer pretend that peace reigned over their world. Odin, the Allfather, knew what this meant. The death of Balder had not just shaken the heavens, it had fractured fate itself. The Norns whispered of a coming storm, a twilight that would turn gods into ash. The scent of Ragnarök lingered like smoke before the blaze. But first, justice. The gods hunted Loki across realms, through Midgard's forests, across Jotunheim's glaciers, and deep into the caverns of Svartalfheim. He changed shapes, took new names, became mist and shadow, serpent and flame. Yet no form could hide him forever. They found him, not in battle, but in fear, and he was brought back, not as a god, but as a prisoner. Justice in Asgard was not swift, it was eternal. The gods dragged Loki into a cavern deep beneath the roots of the world. There they chained him to jagged stone, binding him with the entrails of his own son. His wife, Sigyn, wept beside him, catching the venom of the serpent Odin had placed above him. But even she could not stop the torment forever. When she turned to empty the bowl, the venom struck Loki's face, and his screams shook the earth. They called it punishment. He called it betrayal repaid. Each drop of poison, each shudder of his writhing body, etched one truth into his mind. Ragnarök must come. The gods had built their kingdom on control, on illusion, and he would be the chaos that revealed their hypocrisy. He remembered how they used his wit, yet never accepted him. He remembered how he bled for Asgard, yet was never trusted. He remembered how they banished him, not because he was evil, but because he told the truths they refused to hear. In the darkness, Loki did not rot. He became fire. He became prophecy. He became the scream beneath the world, waiting to rise and tear the heavens down. And the moment would come, not in centuries, but in seconds when the sky cracked open. When his son, the great wolf Fenrir, would break his bonds. When Jormungandr, the world serpent, would rise from the sea. When his daughter, Hel, would fling open the gates of the dead. He would walk among the gods once more, not as their brother, but as their doom. Ragnarök was no longer a myth. It was a promise, and Loki, broken, betrayed, bound in venom, would be its herald. But prophecies are not born from silence. They are carved from agony. In the abyss beneath the world tree, where no sunlight dared reach, and no prayer could echo, Loki hung in a prison not just of chains, but of memory. Every venomous drip from the serpent above was not just pain. It was a reminder of the brother who once clasped his shoulder in camaraderie, of the halls that once rang with his laughter, of the love he had for a home that never truly accepted him. Sigyn, his loyal wife, stood by him, steadfast, even as the gods turned away. With a trembling hand, she caught each drop of venom in a bowl. Her arms ached, her tears fell, and her silence became his sanctuary. But even she, mortal in patience, had to turn to empty the bowl. And in those brief, unavoidable moments, when venom kissed his flesh and fire shot through his veins, Loki screamed, and the world trembled. The mortals believed these quakes were storms or the stirring of the seas. The gods pretended not to hear. But the old ones, the giants, the witches, the dead, they listened. For Loki's pain was more than suffering. It was a signal. In the depths of Helheim, his daughter stirred upon her throne of bones. In the icy coils of the world, Jormungandr shifted. And beyond the horizon of prophecy, Fenrir strained at his chains, eyes gleaming with inherited fury. Loki's punishment was meant to suppress his spirit. Instead, it crystallized his rage into purpose. He whispered through the cracks in reality, sowing discord, nurturing rebellion, spreading truths the gods feared. Even from beneath the world, his influence crept like a shadow over time. His name became a forbidden word among the Aesir, yet was worshipped in the quiet places, by those who saw in him not a villain, but a mirror. He was not the end. He was the beginning of the reckoning. And though his body lay broken and bound, Loki's spirit reached toward the end of days, a moment written not by fate, but forged by fire and fury. He would not merely take part in Ragnarök. He would ignite it. One day the serpent would rise. One day the wolf would break free. One day the chains would rust, the venom would run dry, and the gods who cast him aside would hear his voice again, not as the trickster they scorned, but as the flame that could not be extinguished. And when that day came, the 9 realms would burn not with vengeance, but with the truth that Loki had carried in silence all along. Even gods can fall. It had been born from his silence, from the cold echo of chains that once bound him beneath the earth, from the venom that dripped upon his flesh, from the years where pain whispered prophecy into his soul. The end would not come with fury. It would come with clarity. When the final winter passed, and the sun vanished from the skies, Loki rose, not as a villain, not as a savior, but as a reckoning. Across the shattered roots of Yggdrasil, the 9 realms trembled. From the depths of the ocean rose Jormungandr, the world's serpent, encircling Midgard in its apocalyptic coil. Fenrir broke free of his bindings, his jaws stretching wide enough to consume the moon. And from Helheim, Loki's daughter led a silent army of the dead, their eyes hollow, their hearts cold with forgotten justice. The skies burned as Muspelheim's fire giants, led by the unstoppable Surtur, stormed toward Asgard. And at the heart of it all, walking between the realms like a shadow returning to the flame, was Loki. The Aesir readied themselves for war, their golden armor gleaming for the final time. Odin stood high upon the Bifrost, ravens circling his shoulders. Thor gripped Mjolnir tighter than ever before, his lightning no longer a symbol of might, but of desperation. And when they beheld Loki, adorned not in trickery, but in solemn command, they saw not mischief, but the mirror of their own doom. The battle began like the roar of a dying star. Gods clashed with monsters, fire met ice, fate collided with defiance. Odin and Fenrir, father and beast, locked in a fatal struggle that would see one swallowed whole. Thor and Jormungandr met once more, brother to brother in prophecy's grip, thunder against venom. And Loki met Heimdall, guardian of the gate, the one who always watched but never intervened. Blades crossed not in hatred, but in destiny. As the realms bled into one another and the world began to collapse, Loki did not laugh. He did not taunt. He fought as one who understood the cost of silence, of being unseen, unheard, misunderstood. In his final breath, there was no vengeance, only release. For the gods had stood above all for eons, believing themselves eternal. But Loki had carried the truth all along. Even myths can bleed, and even gods can end.